Imagine falling asleep to the distant echoes of long ships slicing through icy fjords, of ancient chants humming softly through Viking halls, and of warriors dreaming not of glory, but of warmth. The Viking Age wasn't just about raids and rune stones. It was a world of harsh nights, smoky huts, shared furs, and dreams shaped by gods and ghosts. Tonight, we whisper you through every chilling, mundane, and utterly human moment of their story. If you're ready to unwind with the forgotten details of Viking life, far from the battles and closer to their bedtime routines, then wrap yourself in a blanket, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the sleepy bell icon so you never miss another boring tale of the past. Your dreams are about to set sail. You return to the same streets which have acquired a new sound, the scratch of a steady pen. In the space of a few short years, the tribunal has moved from a set of notices to a habit of action, and that habit is disciplined by a figure whose name you will hear whispered with a mix of awe and resentment. You do not see him often in person. His power travels through letters, instructions, and the selection of subordinates who resemble him in one key respect. They prefer the clarity of procedures to the shadows of improvisation. He is less a celebrity than a foreman of a factory that produces certainty, and in a world where fear is common, certainty often appeals, even when it is stern. His concern is not with theatrical punishments, but with the construction of a machine that works the same way in Seville as it does in Toledo, in Valencia as it does in Zaragoza. You feel that ambition in the uniformity of forms and the repetition of phrases that begin to echo from city to city. The work of the tribunal spreads, and with it, the architecture of control becomes clearer. In major towns, permanent courts are established, each with inquisitors appointed under royal authority, assisted by fiscal prosecutors, notaries, jailers, and lay supporters called familiars. You notice that each office finds its rhythm. The notaries keep double copies and cross-reference names. The prosecutors maintain lists of pending accusations. The jailers learn to separate prisoners who talk too much from those who talk too little. And the familiars, citizens embedded in neighborhoods, learn how to listen at the edges of conversations without being invited. Above them all, a central council coalesces into what people will call the Suprema, a body that reads reports, standardizes rules, and keeps up a correspondence so uninteresting in its style that its cumulative effect is profound. The point is not to dazzle, the point is to be everywhere at once through paper and instruction. The Edict of Grace, which once sounded like a generous invitation, evolves into something more exacting, the Edict of Faith. It is read from pulpits in tones that are almost musical in their cadence, to ensure that every ear receives it in the same way. The text grows longer. It lists not only errors in belief, but also small habits that signify loyalty or disloyalty to the church, as imagined by those who prize order. You listen as a preacher recites items that break the day into little checkpoints: what you say when you rise, how you bless food, what days you fast, what words you avoid, how you teach children to speak of the saints. Parishioners hold their breath as if they are weighing their lives against a list they did not write. The mechanisms of confession remain, but now they are timed, organized, and often followed by conditions that ensure a person's return to the fold is visible and measured. If you step into a tribunal office, you would be struck by the look of meticulous continuity. An officer opens a ledger to record the day's business. The margins carry notes from months ago, indicating cross-references to prior cases, kinship ties to previous defendants, or the appearance of a family name in a distant city. Files are sewn with thread at the top corner, the paper folded in the same way each time. The questions asked in interrogations are not improvised but drawn from a growing repertoire of scripts designed to elicit not only confession but pattern. When an accused person admits to lighting candles at a particular hour or washing in a particular way, the scribe has a blank space ready for such a detail because he has heard it before. The unusual case becomes rarer because the definition of a usual case expands to fit more behaviors. A trade emerges in signs. The penitent's garment, coarse, with crosses painted upon it, serves as a temporary skin for those who have abjured error. Tailors learn the exact placement of symbols and the texture that both chafes and lasts. Churches reserve space for these garments once they have been worn, hanging them where the eyes of the community can learn their shape. In some parishes, names are attached, and the memory of correction becomes almost architectural. A second decoration that says to future generations, this is how we define ourselves, and this is how we remember those who needed reminding. Children learn the meaning of such cloth the way they learn the stations of the cross. It is not a spectacle designed to astonish. It is a quiet message installed in wood and plaster. The economic side of the tribunal does not hide itself. It cannot. Confiscations, fines, and fees provide a revenue stream that, together with crown support and other ecclesiastical resources, pays for salaries, paper, ink, buildings, and repairs. Auctions of seized goods bring neighbors together in a marketplace that makes visible the costs of falling afoul of the system. A candlestick makes its way from an investigated home to the altar of a chapel by a path that everyone can trace. A house changes hands and is known thereafter as the house that once belonged to so-and-so, who was reconciled or condemned. The polite language of account books covers human losses with lines and numbers, but the people who live alongside these transactions do not forget the former owners as easily as a ledger does. They remember because memory is yet another form of credit and debt in a city where reputation buys more than money can. Meanwhile, in kitchens and workshops, lives adjust. At the level of the minute, cooking takes place with doors more open than before, as if the presence of witnesses guarantees orthodoxy. Meals are designed not only for taste and nourishment, but for legibility. The inclusion of pork becomes a display in some houses, not because anyone particularly craves it, but because the absence of it would invite questions. In others, the care taken over fasting and feasting follows the public line with textbook precision, not out of love for the rules, but out of fear that love is not enough proof. In workshops, apprentices are trained not merely in their crafts, but in speech. They learn to answer questions in the same way each time, to offer neutral phrases that deflect curiosity, to swear by the same saints as their masters. A young worker, who once might have learned a dozen recipes for glue, now learns a dozen ready-made sentences to present a pious face to anyone who asks. The war in the south against the Nasrid kingdom of Granada continues to supply the monarchy with a purpose that fills sermons and public reading. Victories are cast as signs of divine favor. Setbacks are occasions for collective penance. The language of purification, which once meant personal holiness, now also means territorial conquest and the folding of peoples into a single Christian realm. The tribunal's work seems to many like the spiritual mirror of the army's work. If the generals move borders, inquisitors move boundaries within souls and households. You hear it when a chaplain to soldiers preaches about how the enemy is outside and within, and you hear it again when a parish priest uses nearly the same words about neighbors who backslide. These echoes are not accidental. They come from a shared understanding that unity must be visible in both maps and manners. People whose lives straddle old identities and new expectations develop strategies of survival that are quiet and slow but careful. Families arrange marriages that signal integration through selection of godparents and in-laws with impeccable reputations. They sponsor altars and join confraternities that perform public acts of charity, knowing that such gestures are noticed with approval. A father invents new proverbs for his children, slipping them into conversation as if they were inherited from his own father. Better to pray twice than be asked once why you did not. Better to answer before the question is fully formed. Better to be boring and safe than interesting and alone. These are not the slogans of a brave age. They are the technologies of safety in a city that rewards predictability. The cases that fill tribunal files tend to follow patterns that only a bureaucrat could love, and that a storyteller would find dull, but it is in their dullness that power lies. A woman repeats formulas at the wrong time in her kitchen and is accused by a neighbor who has, for years, resented her for unrelated reasons. A man who changes jobs and falls out with a former partner finds himself named in a complaint that reads like a ledger with human entries. A teenage apprentice brags to friends and repeats a jest about relics that he overheard in a moment of bravado. He is hauled before officials who do not laugh. The outcomes vary according to confession, cooperation, and the tribunal's sense of what will instruct others. Penance may be public or private, confinement may be brief or extended. The ritual of abjuration, once learned awkwardly by officials, becomes so practiced that the words flow in a legal cadence as familiar as the creed. The spectacle that most outsiders will later imagine, the public auto celebrated with tents, platforms and long processions, rarely appears in its more elaborate form in these years, though smaller public acts of penance do occur, and they are enough to set the tone. When larger public ceremonies do happen, they are designed not as entertainments but as lessons. The choreography is precise, the order of participants aligned with categories that the tribunal has been teaching the city to recognize: reconciled, relapsed, obstinate, penitent. The phrases spoken by officials are as formal as the garments they wear. If you are in the crowd, it is not the moment of punishment that lingers in your mind afterward. It is the sequence of categories, the sense that everything and everyone has a place, and that the most important achievement is to remain permanently in the comfortable category of those who watch and never feature. The reach of the system becomes geographical as well as social. Tribunals are planted at distances that ensure travel is possible on known roads within a few days' journey. Officers move along routes that become familiar, staying at predictable inns and knowing which parish. Priests can be counted on to provide accurate lists of households. Towns learn when visits are likely, and rhythms of life bend to accommodate schedules that are never publicly announced, but are, nevertheless, anticipated. A whole infrastructure of cooperation grows between municipal councils and inquisitorial offices. City officials provide storage for seized goods, contribute funds for building works, or lend their own constables to ensure a smooth arrest. In return, they expect the stability that comes when the most dangerous energies of suspicion are bounded by a formal procedure. It is a trade, a little independence exchanged for a little peace. One of the strangest features of this era is the way it encourages people to keep ledgers in their heads that resemble the ledgers the officials keep on paper. A shopkeeper counts prayers as if counting pennies, a kind of moral bookkeeping that reassures him at the end of the day. A mother tallies gestures of public devotion the way another mother might tally the number of loaves baked or shirts mended. Families create their own internal archives, keeping letters that can be shown to prove friendships with unimpeachable neighbors, storing receipts of charitable donations that might one day compensate for whispers. The result is a society that thinks of itself through the metaphor of accounts balanced and imbalances corrected. It is, in its way, a spiritualization of commerce, or perhaps a commercialization of conscience. The role of language grows more important than ever. Not only does the tribunal depend on formulaic words, Entire communities adjust their vocabularies to live within the system. People learn to avoid certain idioms that carry a scent of the older faith. Others sprinkle new phrases into their speech like salt on meat. Sermons become collections of signals, phrases about unity and conscience and the dangers of custom without conviction. Those who have always been devout listen with sincere assent. Those who are anxious learn to echo the phrases in the right settings. And those who dislike the entire apparatus altogether because it has cut into their lives, their businesses, or their families do not say so loudly. They too learn the phrases because silence is not always safe. Not every case flows smoothly. There are appeals not against the doctrine. No appeal is entertained on matters of faith, but against procedure and outcome. Appeals rise through channels that mirror the ones set up for ordinary justice in the kingdom, local consultations, higher reviews, occasional interventions by the royal court when a case intersects with political concerns. The process is not generous, but it is there, and that matters because it creates the feeling that a person is not wholly at the mercy of a single official's mood. When the Central Council intercedes to demand a stricter observance of forms or to correct an inquisitor whose energies outrun the law, the message is double. The center is watching, and the center cares as much about the machine as it does about the result. That message comforts some and chills others. In some corners of the realm, resistance flares in subtler ways. A town council drags its feet on providing resources. A local noble uses influence to shield a client or a servant. A parish priest grows weary of seeing his parishioners marched through the same routine and preaches about mercy with particular emphasis for a season. These gestures matter as ripples of human feeling, but they rarely halt the machine. The system's strength lies in its willingness to wait. It can afford to be patient because time favors routines and wears down improvisation. An official with a long view knows that the best answer to a single moment of defiance is often just another month of forms filled and names entered into lists. The logic that governs the tribunal starts to seep into other parts of life. Guilds emphasize orthodoxy in their admissions more clearly than before. Universities adjust curricula to ensure that students' minds reflect the same boundaries that define their behavior. Books, sermons, and songs are watched with an attention that becomes second nature. The cultural atmosphere is not one of deep intellectual fear so much as one of carefulness. Innovation continues in practical arts and in letters, but it is veined with an anxiety about how far one can go without attracting the wrong kind of notice. A sensible person learns to speak two languages, one for private exploration and one for public tranquility. The city acquires a public face that displays serenity even when its inner thoughts are more complex. As the war in the south draws toward its end, the notion of a completed project fills the air like the smell of rain approaching. The court travels with a sense of destiny. Parishes anticipate a final Te Deum that will be sung with a power the walls have not heard in years. This feeling of culmination affects the tribunal too. Officials, in their way, speak about the alignment of things. Land recovered, doctrine secured, households brought into observable order. The metaphor you hear is medical, a long fever cured by a long regimen, the patient tired but stable. Yet, within that metaphor, you can detect another possibility that nobody wants to name aloud. Sometimes a fever breaks, and in the clarity that follows, one sees problems that the fever had disguised. Victory can reveal as well as heal. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city is as still as it ever gets, you can sense the weight of all these slow changes. The tribunal has not only punished, it has taught parishioners to narrate their lives in religious terms of visible compliance. It has taught officials to cherish steadiness over passion. It has taught families to maintain archives of their own virtue. It has taught the city to replace old patterns of neighborly trust with patterns of institutional certification. Even those who resent it have absorbed its methods. That is how systems succeed, not by winning arguments, but by teaching habits, until the habits are invisible. You may ask yourself, as you listen to the final prayers of soldiers preparing for a campaign season that everyone suspects will be the last, whether the logic of unity that brought the Inquisition from idea to apparatus will stop where it stands or extend itself into other domains. If unity is the medicine that cured one problem, will the doctors prescribe a stronger dose for the next? If public legibility of belief has become the test of belonging, what will happen to those who cannot or will not perform legibility, no matter how many garments they wear or altars they fund? As banners are prepared for a triumphant entry into the last Muslim stronghold, and as the Central Council sharpens its rules to ensure that every city speaks the same legal language, you find the same quiet question perched at the edge of every thought. When victory in war and uniformity in practice finally meet, will the realm choose to fold difference inward with patience, or to cut it off with a decree that will change the lives of thousands in a single season? You return to the city in a winter of damp stone and iron skies, and you notice how the air has changed even if the buildings have not. What once felt like a tightening of habits now feels like the completion of a pattern. The rhythm of bells that used to simply mark the day now seems to announce that a long intention has reached its destination. In the south, soldiers stamp their feet at dawn, breath hanging in clouds as they stand under banners whose threads have been mended and remended over a decade of campaigns. They have become veterans through repetition rather than glory. Posts assigned, supplies tallied, watches kept, drills practiced. The story of this war is as much about wagons and salted meat as it is about cavalry charges. In the towns and cities that have lived under the slow discipline of the new tribunal, you feel a parallel completion. Lists that began a few years ago now read like the registers of a school where every child has been called and accounted for. You can trace the arc of this completion in three spaces: the battlefield, the chancery, and the kitchen. On the battlefield, the end is visible in the simple fact that soldiers speak of the last campaign not as a dream, but as a schedule. In the chancery, clerks write to each other in formulas that presume victory. They do not discuss whether unity will be announced, but how it will be signaled in the language of law, with clauses that lock into each other like joinery. In kitchens, women plan for a spring that might bring a husband or a son home, and wonder what kind of peace a war of this length can leave behind. They do not speak of triumph. They speak of prices and rents, of the cost of wine, of whether this year's almonds will flower under mild weather or be nipped by a late frost. You smell their stews heavy with garlic and feel how the future, however grand in state proclamations, must fit into clay pots and wooden bowls. When the final banners are hoisted over distant walls, processions unspool like thread through cities hundreds of miles away. The victory sermons have been drafted for years in the minds of preachers and now arrive in pulpits polished and ready. They speak of cleansing, of restoration, of the return of an order that was always meant to be. In public squares, the monarchs appear not in a single city but by proxy in many, the messengers rehearsing the phrases that conjure royal presence as effectively as a body can. You sense that the triumph is designed to be portable. Its meaning is meant to reach from palace to parish. Bells ring long and late into the evening, and the rush of sound draws even the reluctant into the mood of the hour. For a moment, the kingdom feels like a single room where voices rise on the same sentence. Inside that sentence, there is a new clause that changes the lives of tens of thousands in a stroke. An order that people who have lived openly as Jews must either enter the church through baptism within a short span of months, or depart the realm entirely, taking only what can be carried, selling what cannot, and trusting their futures to strangers across water or over land. You can feel the way the edict falls, heavier in some neighborhoods than others, heavy in places where houses have held festivals and fasts for generations, heavy in streets where shops have served customers whose grandfathers did business with one another. It is a paper with the power to reach into bread ovens and pull out memories still warm. The words are read in public, and the public's reaction is a study in contradictions. Some nod solemnly at what they believe is needed for unity. Some weep. Many simply do the math of dates and distances in their heads and feel their stomachs. Turn at the logistics. The logistics are everything. Edicts are written in a handful of sentences, but lives need paragraphs of movement. Families who will not convert plan routes that seem safe. Portugal's border is close for some, and impossibly far for others. Ships can be hired, but ships are fewer than travelers, and shipmasters know what urgency does to prices. In many houses, chests are opened and closed, and the lists that once recorded garments for tribunal inventories now record the bare essentials of escape. A father counts the silver that can be hidden in hems and belts. A mother tests the weight of each child's pack to make sure no one will collapse 2 days down the road. These are practical tasks with the taste of grief. The street outside becomes a corridor where buyers and sellers meet under the pressure of an approaching season. The price of a house falls not because it is unlovely, but because there is no time to make a better price. The city is full of such bargains: chairs taken for half their value, linens exchanged for small coins, regrets sealed behind polite phrases, because nobody wants to be dishonest on the day they leave forever. In other houses, water is drawn for a ritual that reshapes identity in minutes and recalibrates lifetimes. Baptismal fonts are cleaned and polished. Priests prepare to stand in doorways and at altars for longer hours than usual. Sponsors are found, sometimes with the warmth of old kindnesses, sometimes with the cold efficiency of clerical organization. The liturgy is the same as the one heard for infants born into the church, but here it has the weight of adulthood, the sense that a world has ended as another begins, and that the person stepping away from the font carries not only sanctifying water, but also a permanent memory of what was given up and why. You stand at the back and watch faces that are hard to read: relief, shame, hope, calculation. Perhaps all four in the same eyes. You see how neighbors behave, some genuinely welcoming, some awkward with their own uncertainty, some keeping a dignified distance out of respect or discomfort. You feel how fragile ceremonies can be when they are asked to do more than they were designed to do. At ports, practicalities multiply. Officials who never imagined themselves as logisticians of an exodus find themselves sorting people into groups, dealing with the nagging fears of theft and fraud, of disease introduced by cramped quarters, of arguments that flare under pressure. Shipmasters check lists and measure cargo holds, calculating the balance between bodies and ballast, between food for the journey and the money that could be made by carrying more passengers. Children cry not from ideology, but because the noise and the press are too much. Adults settle into a tense quiet, their voices level and thin. On the quays, a few Christians come to say goodbye to business associates and neighbors who have been part of their lives in ways too ordinary to make a chronicle but too important to forget. They exchange small gifts like talismans, knife sheaths, cloth purses, a carved spoon, as if such tangible things can keep the connection alive in a world where letters will be rare and dangerous. You might expect the tribunal to be everywhere in these days of decision, but its presence is not the one that dominates the scene. Its files are full and its habits are steady, but the center of gravity has shifted beyond accusations and reconciliations to a larger act of sorting. Yet the tribunal's methods are present in the details: lists kept, names checked, property noted, documents signed with seals and dates. The same tidy handwriting that has recorded the abjurations of error now records the fact of departure or the fact of conversion. In that sense, the apparatus that was designed to purify the interior of the Christian fold now provides the administrative muscle for a moment when the border of that fold is being redrawn with a thick line. The city, used to the rhythms of edicts and deadlines, falls into step without needing to be told how. A habit has been trained that can now be repurposed. The war's end and the edict's enforcement share a calendar, and that calendar changes everything from prayers to market days. In monasteries, Latin hymns rise more often in Thanksgiving. In parish churches, the vernacular homilies lean into the themes of unity, obedience, and the proper display of faith. The tone is often gentle, few preachers relish cruelty, and many know the sorrow in their own hearts. But the themes are consistent, and consistency is the tool authority prefers when it wants to shape a population that must keep working, marrying, and having children. You feel how the words seep into ordinary talk. People cite phrases from sermons as if they were proverbs. They call this a time of cleansing, and cleansing sounds like something one does to a kitchen floor as much as to a map. The metaphor, repeated enough, loses its sting. There are countercurrents you can sense if you stand at the right corners. A scholar at a university, delighted by the notion of a growing, stable realm, composes a grammar and presents it to the Queen as if to say, "A nation's power is a language written down." He means it as a gift and a tool, an instrument for teaching and administration, a way to make all the kingdom's children read the same texts in the same way. It is not an act of coercion, yet even this scholarly joy in order belongs to the same family of thought as the tribunal's love of categories and the court's desire for unity. The instincts that assemble a strong edifice are busy in letters and law at the same time. In the oldest quarter of the city, where workshops have changed hands 3 times in a generation, you see how families map their futures on the fly. Some, whose kin embrace baptism, choose to remain, displaying a public piety that is emphatic without being gaudy. Crucifixes hung where the light catches them, open doors on feast days, gifts of bread to neighbors whose charity is now indispensable. Others decide to leave despite the difficulty, calculating that they cannot build a new house where the old house is watched and judged. They will become wives and husbands in cities across the water, uncles in neighborhoods where the language is another shape altogether, mothers who tell stories of the land behind them in a voice that is simultaneously tender and guarded. Their children will learn to make bread with different wheat and will pronounce words with different vowels. They will measure their own piety against parents who have carried the memory of one law into the practice of another, or into the practice of none, depending on where the journey takes them. The tribunal remains busy with its original mandate, handling the cases that fall within its well-defined lanes. Those who backslide, those who practice with caution and are discovered, those who use the cover of piety to cheat, blaspheme, or undermine public order. It is not that the machine pauses for the exodus. It is that the machine now hums alongside a larger machine, moving people through gates and onto roads. The tribunal adds a visible layer to the collective conscience. It is not only that you should be faithful, it is that you should appear faithful, in ways that are legible to a system that has taught itself how to read. People who make mistakes suffer consequences. People who are innocent sometimes find that innocence is not straightforward to prove. The old wisdom, keep your head down, do the obvious things, avoid drama, becomes the new commandment that everyone can quote. One of the quietest casualties of these years is the mixed neighborhood, the street where houses of different rights once stood within earshot of each other's songs. The city does not immediately become monotone, markets still thrive on difference, and foreign merchants still bring fabrics, spices, and news. But a certain kind of casual pluralism changes. Children grow up with fewer opportunities to ask the simplest questions of a neighbor whose calendar is different. The number of times someone says, "Tell me about your feast," shrinks. The number of times someone says, "We do it this way," grows. The change does not happen in one season. It shows in the jokes people stop telling and the foods they stop offering. It shows in the way people describe themselves with a confidence that feels like a wall. You hear stories of heartbreak that never make it into official books. A family divides at a dinner table, some to the church, some to the road. Brothers do not speak after parting. A daughter returns to a house that feels like a museum of a life she no longer lives because the objects are the same, but the meanings have been rewritten. A craftsman who chose baptism after long reluctance loses customers anyway because the category he has entered still has a door that remains only half open. He turns his skills to a new guild, learns a new clientele, and in the meantime teaches his son a different style of patience. Not the patience to wait for justice, but the patience to pretend you have received it already in order to earn it eventually. At the level of government, you see the craving for permanence turn into brick and timber. The tribunal occupies more solid quarters, not cellars borrowed for emergencies, but purpose-adapted rooms with barred windows and shelves built for files. The chair that once wobbled is replaced by one made to last across dozens of inquisitors. Tenures. The court learns to talk about itself in the future tense. We will continue, we will improve, we will standardize. The men who run it, stern and sometimes tired, take pride in the smoothness of their operations, as if the quality of mercy could be measured in the crispness of a transcript or the evenness of a signature. Their pride is not unearned. A machine that treats like cases alike is safer than a machine that runs on whim, but the very safety produced by uniformity can make the outcomes feel inevitable, and inevitability is a cold comfort to a person walking past the tribunal door for the first time. By the time summer darkens into autumn, the maps on which royal councillors place their markers look cleaner. Borders are tidy, titles are confirmed, alliances are recalculated in light of a realm that has presented to Europe a unified face and, to its own citizens, a single set of expectations. The harvest comes in, and as always, it proves stronger than politics. Bread must be baked, grapes must be pressed, olives must be bruised and cured. Men who argued loudly about edicts in the spring now speak quietly about yields, pests, and the cost of pressing. Women compare loaves and the firmness of cheeses. There is relief in this normalcy, and the governing class counts on that relief to heal wounds which, in truth, will not heal so easily. Time is a conservative force. It rearranges suffering into stories that can be told without breaking down, and in that translation, people find a way to go on. What then is the lesson of these years when looked at from a corner of a market where shadows lie long in the late afternoon? It is that institutions teach more by habit than by decree. The Inquisition taught a realm how to think of conformity as a publicly verifiable good, how to keep moral ledgers alongside financial ones, how to read the lives of neighbors as if they were documents in need of annotation. The Crown taught a realm how victory in war could pair with victory in administration, how banners and forms could fly side by side, how unity could be made to mean both salvation and a system. The Church taught a realm that grace could be managed through procedures without losing all its tenderness, and that discipline could be presented with enough solemnity to feel like love, even when it stung. Ordinary people taught one another how to live under new rules without losing the small kindnesses that keep communities alive. You stand at a threshold that looks like a finish line and realize it is a gate into a long corridor. The tribunals. Files have only begun to accumulate. The methods honed in cases about one group of people will soon be applied to others. The habits formed in kitchens and workshops will meet new pressures as the century turns, and the meaning of unity will be tested by different kinds of difference. If a realm can expel those who will not conform and reconcile those who will, what happens when those who remain are accused of wavering anyway? And if language, law, and liturgy have been braided into a rope that can pull a nation in one direction, how tightly can it be pulled before it frays? These are questions that the early founders of the machine could not fully answer, and that the ordinary people of cities like yours will be forced to consider in the quieter ways of survival. The banners are furled for now, and the edicts are filed, but you cannot help asking as you walk home along the familiar street past the tribunal's door, when the next test of unity arrives under the crescent of a different community's customs, under the candle of a manuscript forbidden, under the whisper of a joke told at the wrong table, how will the machine they assembled decide to move, and who will have the patience or the courage to stand in its path? You begin in the space where nothing looks unusual, the threshold of a parish church on an ordinary feast day, or the wooden rail of a market stall where thread and onions change hands for copper coins. Everything that matters in an inquisitorial case begins precisely there, at the point where life looks routine. There is no thunderclap, only a whisper that attaches itself to a name. It might be a neighbor remarking that your evening candles are lit a little too promptly on a Friday, or that your stew always avoids pork as if it were a matter of principle rather than taste, or that you keep old books and handle them as if they were talismans. The whisper collects weight each time it is repeated until it becomes a rumor with a spine, and then the rumor becomes a farmer, a public reputation suitable to be cuffed into a shape that officials can touch. Farmer is not proof. It is the permission for the machine to wake up. The machine wakes up quietly. In the house that serves as the tribunal's local seat, oil lamps burn 2 hours longer than usual while a notary draws fresh lines in a ledger and titles a new file with your name and a simple description of the suspected error. The file's first page bears a date, then a formula that has been copied so many times it flows from the hand without thought, in the name of the Holy Office for the correction of heresy. Your name is written out in full, followed by the names of your parents and grandparents if they can be found, a genealogy of responsibility that points backward like the shadow of the day. If you are married, your spouse's name is added, for this file is not entirely yours. Households are rarely cleanly divisible when it comes to habits that arise at table and in bed. Before anything is done to you, something is done around you. The Edict of Faith is read from pulpits at intervals designed to refresh the city's memory. It lists errors in belief and practice with a thoroughness that feels almost pastoral, as if the church cares enough to enumerate each trap for your benefit. In practical terms, it is a sieve held over the community. What passes through without catching is ordinary life, and what catches is brought to the office in the form of denunciations. Some denunciations are precise, marked by dates and places. At dusk, in the kitchen, before the meat stew, he washed his hands and said words in a language I do not know. Others are foggier, scented more with dislike than with detail, yet they arrive in the same formal shape because the notary distills them into standardized statements. The accuser's identity will be protected not always out of charity, but as a principle the system guards, believing it shields witnesses from retaliation. The moment of arrest, when it comes, is less violent than your fear imagined and more thorough than you hoped. Officers come at the hour they prefer for quiet, early morning or deep night, so there will be fewer eyes, fewer entanglements, less need for words. The knock at your door is not loud, the authority lies not in volume, but in the keys and sealed paper in a hand you cannot refuse. You are told to dress and to come. If you ask for time to speak with your spouse, you might be granted a few minutes under watch, enough to place a hand on a shoulder, to say the nonsense words families say when they have nothing else to say, and to calculate with your eyes whether something can be hidden, buried, passed quietly to a child. The officers do not leave after you, they stay to inventory your things. The inventory is the first list that feels like an autopsy of daily life. 1 bed with straw mattress, 1 cover of wool, coarse, 6 pewter plates, a cooking pot of iron, 2 knives, 1 jagged, a crucifix of painted wood, a small chest with a lock, coins counted and recorded, papers if any found. The best version of this moment is that the officers do not break anything, and that the notary's script is untrembling. There is nothing theatrical in the walk to the tribunal. Your neighbours will see if they are wakeful early or late. Some will pretend not to see as a courtesy. Others will watch because watching is what people do. You will be led into a room that is both modest and overwhelming, with a crucifix and an empty chair behind a table, and you will be told to sit. Your chains, if any, are usually more symbolic than heavy. Manacles exist, but they are not always fastened. A clerk asks your name, your parents' names, your city of birth, your trade, and how long you have lived where you live. This is the first time the file takes your voice and presses it between pages. You are asked whether you know why you are here. There is no harm in saying that you do not know. There is harm in seeming to know too much. You are asked to swear, to tell the truth, and you do, because all scripts begin this way. What happens next is slow. You are escorted to the secret prisons, which are less dungeons than simple rooms, rough but serviceable, called secret because they are not open to casual visitors, because their doors close on lives that are meant to be forgotten by the market and remembered only by the ledger. There is a mattress or a pallet, there is a pot. There is food, the cost of which will be recorded and may be charged to your seized property if you have any, or covered by a small fund of alms if you do not. If you are ill, a surgeon is summoned, not because the tribunal is tender, but because it needs you alive and lucid to answer questions. A dead or raving prisoner is a problem the procedure does not enjoy solving. You count the hours by sounds that find their way through walls, footsteps, a cough, a distant bell. You learn the strange truth that time slows in a cell to a different viscosity, thicker than the hours you knew. Back in the office, the case is assigned a rhythm. You will appear before the inquisitors in a room where they sit at a table with the crucifix and perhaps a relic. The setting is meant to turn every human exchange into a moral exchange under a heavenly gaze. The notary takes his place. The fiscal, a prosecutor in all but name, has a text ready, a libellus of accusation that does not yet reveal names of witnesses but frames the charge in the language of categories. It will say that you are suspected of Judaizing or of adhering to old rites. It will list patterns that match what has been heard about your household. You are asked to respond. You will be offered a chance to confess and throw yourself on the mercy of the tribunal. You will be told that voluntary confession at this stage can mitigate penalties. This is the moment when the pressure to narrate yourself in the tribunal's preferred form grows intense. If you confess to something the tribunal is prepared to forgive, you may be reconciled. If you deny flatly, the inquiry lengthens, and length is its own punishment. There is a midwife in the procedure named the calificadores, theologians who read statements and judge whether the acts described, if true, constitute heresy or error in the Church's terms. They do not meet you. They meet the file, they underline phrases. They write marginalia like a schoolmaster grading a dense essay, deciding which portions are dogmatically dangerous and which are mere improprieties of habit. Their tools are definitions and canons. Their power is to shape the terrain. When they have marked the pages, the case goes back to the inquisitors, who then cross-examine you with a map in mind. They ask you about Fridays and fasts, about prayers at dawn, about how you dispose of the remains of animals in your kitchen. They ask you to describe old family customs, and they watch whether your first sentence is, "we used to," or "we do." If you ask for counsel, the system grants a narrow version of it, a court-appointed advocate who is less a defense attorney than a guide to procedure. He can advise you on how to speak, on what forms to request, on errors to avoid that might make things worse. He cannot pierce the secrecy around accusers, and he cannot argue doctrine. His presence is a sign that the system wants to see itself as just. In practice, his usefulness depends on what you have done, what you will admit, and the disposition of the tribunal in that season. A good advocate in a good season can turn a harsh penance into a milder one, a temporary disgrace into a survivable burden. The record will show he was present, that he spoke on your behalf, that he requested time or leniency. Whether mercy flows is not in his pen. Your statements will be taken more than once, sometimes days apart, sometimes weeks. Each time, the notary records your words with repetition that drives you mad, even as it protects the file from claims of improvisation. Asked whether he kept the fast of the old law, he said no. Asked whether he had seen others do so, he said no. Asked whether he had lit candles at the hour before sundown on the 6th day, he said no. The simplicity of the questions is their trap. A long answer looks evasive. A short answer looks rehearsed. You are taught, in real time, how difficult truth becomes when it is poured into narrow spouts. There are rules about pressure. The tribunal does not care for blood, it cares for clarity. Physical coercion exists in its repertoire and is wrapped in legal formulae and medical precautions. It must be authorized, it must be recorded, it must follow a declaration that the evidence is nearly sufficient but that the accused remains obstinate. A surgeon will be present to judge whether the body can endure the strain, and the inquisitors will repeat that their aim is not pain but the freeing of the tongue to tell the truth. They will say that mercy lies in confession. If your case goes in that direction, you will learn a new vocabulary of sounds your own throat can make, and the notary will keep writing through your noises. But in many cases, the machine prefers the long patience of paperwork to the risky speed of coercion. It makes sense for them. Bodies are unpredictable. Files are obedient. Between appearances, your life is stripped to its arithmetic. A daily ration arrives and you eat it quickly. You try to sleep and find that sleep has learned to dislike your new bed. If you have a spouse, she or he will petition for the right to send you a rosary, a blanket, perhaps a bit of cooked food. The tribunal will approve what it deems appropriate, as long as it does not corrupt the process. News does not come to you except in the subtle changes of the staff's faces. You learn to read the notary's steps in the corridor, the stiffness of the fiscal's smile, the sunlight that moves across the same patch of wall each morning. You count the beads on your rosary twice, then thrice, not as a form of devotion, but as a way to measure an invisible clock. Once your depositions are complete and your denials or confessions recorded, the file takes on a life more purposeful than your own. It is read in a meeting called a consulta de fe, a council of faith, where the inquisitors and advisors consider what to do. The options form a ladder on which mercy and severity are rungs, a warning and penance, a public abjuration wearing a coarse garment before your neighbors, a term of imprisonment, exile, confiscation of goods complete and final, or, if your stubbornness is judged beyond patience or your relapse deliberate, abandonment to secular justice, which the law pretends is a different hand delivering the final blow, even though everyone knows the hands belong to the same body. Most cases never climb to the top rungs. Most stop lower, in the territory of shame and loss, and the slow repair of life with a permanent mark on the ledger. If you are reconciled, you will be reconciled in a manner designed to teach others what the process looks like. You will wear the penitent's garment with painted crosses. The fabric will scratch. The crosses will be a color chosen to be seen. You will stand during a sermon that repeats the categories, errors, light and grave, the steps back to the fold, the proof that mercy is not weakness. You will say words you did not write. The priest will say words written a century ago. You will be assigned acts to perform, prayers to repeat, visits to make, alms to give. If you are confined for a term, the confinement will be recorded in the file like the cost of your food. Everything will be written down so that when your children come, years later, to ask whether your family can be received into a confraternity, the clerk can pull your file and measure the risk through paper. After the public part is over, a quieter process continues. Your name goes on to a list that will be sent to parishes and guilds. The garment you wore may be hung in a chapel with your name written nearby, or the name of your father, or an initial that everyone recognizes. Your house, if confiscated, will be auctioned or assigned, and it will be known for a generation as the house that once was yours. If you return home, you will find neighbors who are solicitous, neighbors who are careful, and neighbors who are suddenly busy when you pass. You will learn to anticipate which streets are kinder. You might change your trade because customers are creatures of caution. You will teach your children a new discipline of ordinary piety, not because you have become more devout, but because you understand that repetition will repaint the family's face over time. What is strangest about the whole process is how much of it belongs not to grand ideas, but to ordinary crafts. The tailor who stitched your garment learned his cuts from his master. He does not think about theology while he measures. The notary who wrote your name on the first page of the file prided himself on a hand so regular it could survive a flood and still be legible. His training was in patience, not in doctrine. The surgeon who examined you counted pulse and breath as he had in every other room where the sick prayed for help. The jailer knew which locks responded to oil in the winter. The cook knew how many loaves to bake for the number of prisoners, how much wood was needed to keep the oven at heat, and when to send a boy for more salt. The tribunal is made of these acts as much as it is made of laws and sermons. If you were to peel away the theology, you would find logistics humming. There is another ledger that never makes it onto paper, written instead in the minds of those who watch. In that ledger, people balance their own behavior against the cost of making a file. Merchants ask themselves whether a jest is worth the edge it gives to a rival's whisper. Parishioners consider whether to give more alms at a public collection, so their names will be heard. Mothers teach daughters a new politeness about windows and doors. Do not do anything that can be misunderstood where it can be seen. Fathers rehearse with sons the correct responses to predictable questions. Yes, we fast when the priest tells us. Yes, we love the saints. Yes, we teach our children their prayers. Yes, we eat what the parish eats. The point is less sincerity than legibility. The tribunal, in teaching the city what to watch, has taught the city how to perform. If you are acquitted, and it happens, the machine is just as thorough. The decision is written and sealed. Goods that were seized are returned if they were not. damaged or sold. Your name is cleared but not erased. Anyone who knows will continue to know, and memory in a city is a slow, sticky thing. You may feel relief that the file closes without a permanent stain. You may also feel the strange indignity that your innocence needed to be processed. The best case, you tell yourself, is peace, and peace often looks like a boring evening at your own table with bread, stew, a candle, and nothing to explain. By the time your case ends, whether in reconciliation, confinement, acquittal, or the harder road, the file is thicker than you want to imagine. Its pages smell faintly of the oil from the notary's hands. The thread that binds it is tied in a knot the clerk favours, a knot he can replicate blindfolded. It is placed on a shelf next to the files of others, whose names fade in ink to the same grey over years. If someone returns in a decade to ask about you, the file will be pulled down and opened. The clerk will run a finger along the lines, as if reading a familiar prayer. You will not be there to correct the details that make you human. On paper, you are a set of answers and penalties, a person whose life the machine learned to summarize. As you step back from the details, the candles lit, the chains that chafe, the files that thicken, you begin to see the case not as an exception, but as an instruction manual written into the city's memory. It tells everyone how difference will be handled, how suspicion becomes an index entry, how mercy is dispensed in measured units. That manual will be reread in the years to come, applied to new names and different habits, widened to fit other communities who live in the kingdom's shadow and light. You might ask yourself, as the oil lamp in your cell gutters and the guards' footsteps pause on the stair, whether the most permanent thing about the case is your own fate, or the way the city learns to think about fate as a process that happens in an office. And if a system can turn a whisper into a file so efficiently, what happens when it listens for new whispers in new quarters, where the rules are the same, but the people under the lamp have different faces, different songs, and a different way of counting the days? You return to the corridor where footsteps echo like a metronome, steady and indifferent, and you begin to understand that the Inquisition's power lies not only in verdicts, but in the long middle of a case. This middle is a landscape of routines you can predict but cannot escape, a place where every hour is filled with small, careful acts that make the larger decisions possible. The tribunal prefers this terrain because it favors the disciplined over the dramatic. Men who run offices, who keep schedules, who believe in lines neatly drawn, thrive here. You come to see that your life, every word, every object, every gesture, is being translated into a grammar of procedure so that other men, far from the room, can read you as easily as they might read a sermon or a statute. The morning begins with the jailer's key and the notary's pen. Bread and a cup of thin broth arrive, and then a summons that is less a voice than a gesture. In the chamber, the crucifix presides and the table hosts the same cast you have learned to recognize by silhouette. The inquisitors whose questions come like beads on a rosary, the fiscal who worries the case like a dog at a bone, and the notary who is the only one among them with a craft so precise that he can take pride in his handwriting without sinning against humility. The questions are repetitive by design. Each time you hear the same formula, you understand more clearly that they are testing not only your memory but your willingness to let them compose your story. They want you to come within reach, to step into the pattern where you can be sorted with other cases already resolved. The file thickens with each visit, and it has a structure that protects the tribunal as much as it constrains you. There is the initial report of Farmer that justified the opening of the case, the formal articles of accusation, your depositions, the marginal notes of the calificadores who mark doctrinal points, the notations of expenses for food, for paper, for the surgeon's call, for the candles burned in your interviews. Even mercy must be paid for. Nothing is free except the air you breathe in the cell. Accounts are tallied with the same neatness as sins. If you close your eyes, you can hear the careful rustle of folded paper and the click of the seal as it is pressed into warm wax, small sounds that confirm you are entering the city's permanent memory, one crisp sheet at a time. Outside the chamber, other gears turn. Officers visit your house, again or still, recovering documents, letters, a prayer book, with a note in the margin that raises a question, a recipe that seems too carefully inherited from a grandmother no one remembers as a Christian. They speak, with neighbors who have learned the sanctioned way to recount a life, not by temperament or kindness, but by observable habits that can be indexed under headings like fasts, feasts, candles, blessings, and the discarding of bones. They invite parish clergy to speak about your attendance at Mass, your presence at processions, your almsgiving, your confession habits. Perhaps the priest says he has known you for years. Perhaps he says he would like to say more, but he cannot, which says enough. Each testimony becomes a unit that fits the puzzle of a predetermined shape. The tribunal is building a mosaic from tiles it has already cut and numbered. You learn how many people have roles you did not know existed before your arrest. The alguacil, the officer of arrests, has an instinct for timing that keeps the city calm. He prefers dawn or midnight because movements then leave shallower footprints. The portero controls doors, decides who may enter, even to deliver bread or a message, keeps order in the waiting rooms where anxious faces rehearse the right phrases. The messenger knows which roads are fast in dry weather and which bridges wash out in heavy rain. The surgeon judges bodies before and after pressure, careful to treat the body as a tool that must be preserved for the work of truth. The chaplain, to prisoners, listens in a way that suggests he has heard every human version of the same story, and that it does not harden his heart, but does not soften it either. Each role is ordinary in itself. Together they form a net that tightens without visible effort. Your advocate, if appointed, is a sober man who reads the file on your behalf when allowed and speaks in a vocabulary that tries to turn severity into proportionality. He cannot argue theology. The tribunal will not debate the map of orthodoxy with you, but he can mark the difference between error light and error grave, between ignorance and intention, between a habit inherited thoughtlessly and a persuasion held secretly and taught to others. He advises you to admit what can be admitted without sinking yourself, to present acts of contrition in the language the tribunal trusts, to ask for spiritual exercises in penance that are visible and countable, a number of prayers said publicly, a series of alms given under the tribunal's eye, a pilgrimage walked to a shrine nearby. He is not a hero. He is a guide to the interior paths of a maze designed by others. The calificadores, whose names you will probably never know, leave their fingerprints on the file in tones of a schoolroom. They underline words like error, heresy, relapse, scandal. They circle a phrase you use to describe a Friday evening and note its resemblance to patterns already condemned. They compare your statement with notes from cases in other towns. The uniformity of their concern makes the realm feel smaller and the net wider. In their marginalia you see the tribunal's claim to be rational, nothing personal, nothing whimsical, only the application of categories that have been argued, approved, and repeated across years. If you feel a sense of unfairness rising as you read the cold precision of their notes, it has nowhere to land. The tribunal is allergic to the warm language of fairness because it cannot be indexed or balanced in a ledger. If the case advances toward the harsher middle, the room changes in small ways you will not fail to notice. A new table appears with ropes and a pitcher. The surgeon takes a seat closer than before. The door is kept open a crack as if to ease a conscience somewhere that prefers not to hear sounds muffled too completely. The inquisitors repeat the formula that unites severity with pastoral care, declaring their intention is not pain but truth, and that truth is a path back to mercy for the soul that tsunamis of fear have taught to lie. They do not wish to injure, they wish to unlock. Coercion, when it is used, is enveloped in a veil of authorization. The file must say the evidence nearly suffices and that your obstinacy has become the final obstacle to completion. You learn that even pressure can be placed on a timetable. It occurs only on certain days at particular hours, with witnesses, with pauses. The moment is framed like a rite, and that framing satisfies the tribunal's conscience, even as it bruises your body and your calm. But the truth, as you will hear from those who work in these rooms, is that the larger part of cases do not rely on this harder persuasion. The tribunal prefers the conspiratorial power of time and repetition. It wants you to make its task easy by stepping into the script it's written for you. Your advocate's advice reflects this. If you have done what they suspect, tell it in the tribunal's own language, and let yourself be placed on a rung of the ladder that leads to reconciliation rather than ruin. If you have not done what they suspect, consider whether innocence can be cast in a shape that looks like their idea of a mistake corrected. The value of such counsel is contested by those who love justice in a purer form, but within the tribunal's walls, purity is a subversive luxury. Prudence is the coin that buys survivable outcomes. There are rules, too, about time limits that are invisible to those outside the file but matter to those holding it. A confession presented within the period of grace is one thing. A confession offered after the edict has hardened into a command carries a different weight. A first-time offense is weighed distinctly from a relapse, and relapse carries the smell of stubbornness the inquisitors find personally offensive because it resists the pedagogical claim they make over souls. If a confession lists others as companions in error, the tribunal will protect names written on that list with the same secrecy it affords denunciations from the street, and the circle widens as a matter of course. You feel the web spreading through families and partnerships as if suspicion were a dye poured into water, tinting relations you thought colorless. Meanwhile, the city watches itself in mirrors the tribunal has installed. Guilds keep their own lists and require attestations of clean standing for new admissions. Confraternities confide their scruples to the tribunal with a sort of relief. That difficult decisions can be offloaded onto an authority that promises consistency. Parish registers become more detailed. Marriages are weighed for suitability not only by fortune or sympathy, but by the murkiness of a lineage. Whispers about grandparents become relevant again in an era that had almost let them fade. The phrase limpieza, cleanliness, acquires a legal weight in admissions and exclusions. You can tell how far the tribunal's categories have wandered. Beyond its walls, by the way, families start stories about themselves with the phrase, "we have always been," as if the past can be trimmed to fit the present's needs. Back in the prison, monotony turns clever. A prisoner learns to memorize fragments of psalms simply to anchor the day, or to mark on the wall a tiny notch every time the guard's shadow passes a particular bar of light, constructing a calendar the tribunal does not approve or forbid, because it does not care to notice. Visits by confessors are both a comfort and a theatre. The counsel is personal and sometimes kind. It is also, as the prisoner knows, invisible ink on the file, because the confessor will leave a note that your heart is softened or your mind stiffened, and these notes make numbers move in the minds of men who must decide an outcome. A gift of fruit from a spouse can become a narrative in the file, a sign of a family's willingness to support a penitent's reform, or, in a suspicious reading, a sign of reciprocal encouragement to resist what the tribunal requires. The prisoner learns that nothing is free of meaning once the file exists. Meaning attaches like dust in a dry room. When the tribunal is ready to move past this long middle, you will feel it in certain preparations that ripple beyond your cell. If reconciliation is the likely path, the tailor receives a measure and prepares a garment whose roughness is a form of punctuation at the end of a sentence. The parish priest is informed so he may prepare a sermon with appropriate themes not only for you, but for the congregation who must learn once again that error is correctable if confessed. The notary prepares the formula of abjuration, which you will repeat. It will feel at once too general to reflect the individual path that brought you to this point, and too specific in the way it insists on categories you may not recognize as your own. But in a system that lives on repetition, the formula is a comfort to those who hold it. The city will be invited to watch, not to humiliate you, the tribunal insists, but to prove that the flock is being tended with care, and that the crooked have been straightened with measured force. If your case sits on a higher rung, if the file carries the smell of relapse or the stain of obstinacy, if the calificadores have marked a doctrine you promoted actively, you will see different signs. A larger public ceremony will be planned, and your name will be entered among others in a list that determines the order of appearance. A platform will be constructed, benches arranged, and a procession plotted. The city will know because carpenters and masons cannot keep their work invisible even if they keep their mouths closed. Shops whisper dates, and mothers keep children from wandering too freely. You can feel the gravity that public ritual exerts even on those who dislike it. Spectacle uses curiosity to bind a community to the forms that define it. From the beginning of your case to the end of this middle, the cost of everything is assessed and often charged to you. The ledger that began as a manner of recording the tribunal's operations becomes a way to recover the cost of discipline from the disciplined. Food, shelter, attendance, paper, ink, hours of labor. Each is written down with a number. In a prosperous case where confiscations have yielded something, the tribunal pays itself back and counts the balance as if to remind itself that order too must live within means. In a poor case, alms collected in the name of the Holy Office cover the costs. Even this charity is recorded. Generosity accumulates in a different kind of ledger that is shown to donors as proof their money performs a spiritual function. You begin to see how the tribunal has colonized accounting and turned it into a moral instrument. The most striking thing about this period, though, is how the tribunal trains everyone to speak in measured sentences. The accused learns formulas that will calm the room. The advocate learns when to ask and when to say nothing. The priest learns homilies that square mercy with warning. The officer learns to say only what is necessary and never what is merely true. The city at large picks up this discipline. In taverns, men lower voices when certain topics almost rise. In markets, women avoid phrases that could be heard in two ways. Children are schooled in public piety with a new exactitude, small bodies, dipping and crossing at prescribed moments so that they may become large bodies who will not accidentally stand out. This is the tribunal's accomplishment no one can number. It has taught a kingdom to distrust improvisation, and yet at odd times improvisation peeks through. A confessor tears up in the privacy of his room after listening to a prisoner whose stubbornness is only the other face of integrity. A notary copies a line twice on purpose because he wants to slow down the machinery for a breath. A jailer slips a crust of bread to someone whose ration ran thin as if he could compensate the universe for one small deficit. The system is powerful and sure, but it is staffed by people whose souls are not all the same shape. Those moments rarely change outcomes. They do, however, preserve in the quiet places a memory that humans kept trying to be human even while they kept the machine in perfect running order. As the middle of your case accumulates its slow gravity, you see how your fate is moving toward one of a few doors. They are all familiar to those who run the place. They can draw you a chart on a scrap of paper, though they never will, showing the branching paths. Confession yields reconciliation, defiance yields more pressure, relapse yields ceremony, and abandonment to another hand that carries the last instrument in the sequence. The remarkable thing is how few surprises the tribunal allows itself. It prefers outcomes. It knows how to stage, how to clothe, how to inscribe. What shocks you, who live inside the file, is not shocking to those outside. This is not because they are cruel. It is because they have seen too many files find their way to the same shelf. You return to your cell after another day where small words were said and set in ink, and you realize that the case has taught you a way of thinking you did not have before. You have learned to narrate yourself in categories. You have learned to prepare answers to likely questions. You have learned the value of being boring. You would like to think this knowledge will rescue you, and perhaps it will. But there is another knowledge forming at the edge of your thoughts, that your story no longer belongs entirely to you. It belongs to the file, to the men who read it, to the city that hears about it in structured fragments, to the courtroom that will soon present you, reconciled or obstinate or exemplary, to an audience who will learn what the system wishes to teach. And you wonder, in the quiet between the guards' rounds, whether the ritual that lies ahead will treat you as a person or as a category in motion. Will the garment scratch less if you wear it with sincerity? Will your neighbors remember the penance more than the cause? Will the form that the tribunal loves so much prove itself capable of mercy's warmth in front of the crowd, or will it only show the cool beauty of regularity, leaving you to supply the warmth by how you stand, how you hold your head, how you step down from the platform when the words have been said and the city has gone back to its ledgers and its loaves? You wake into the day of sentence the way you wake into a storm you heard forming all night, not surprised, only braced. The routine that has steadied you, bred at a certain hour, a guard's key at another, shifts by 1 or 2 beats. The notary arrives earlier. The jailer's tone is more clipped. A chaplain lingers longer at the doorway to your cell. When you are brought into the chamber, the table holds not only the crucifix and the familiar instruments of a hearing, but also a sealed packet. Its wax bears the dent of a seal that belongs to the tribunal rather than a single man, a sign that this is no longer a matter of questions but of conclusions. You notice at once that they have moved you out of the grammar of maybe into the grammar of will. You will hear, you will abjure, you will perform this or that, you will be reconciled, you will be transferred, you will lose, you will endure. The verbs do the work now. Your part is to breathe and to listen. If your case ends in reconciliation, the room itself becomes a liturgy. The inquisitors sit with their papers, the notary reads the formula, the chaplain stands by with prayers. You are told to rise, to kneel, to repeat words that have been repeated so often they feel less like speech and more like a groove worn into air. You abjure the errors you are said to have held, and, whether or not your heart matches the grammar, your voice does the work of making the file whole. It is not theatre for its own sake. It is a ceremony designed to be read, copied, and cited so that your case may serve as a precedent for the next. You note that the sentence mentions not only your acts, but your future acts as conditions. You will wear a garment bearing crosses for a period. You will attend Mass publicly. You will give alms in a prescribed pattern. You will abstain from this or that association. You will present yourself for confession. At intervals, the tribunal will verify. The emphasis is not on punishment alone, but on watchfulness made into habit. If the case has walked the harder path, the language grows colder without changing its cadence. A declaration says you have persisted, or that you have relapsed, or that your teaching has crossed a line they draw with a ruler pressed firmly to the table. The phrase that tells most truths while pretending to tell very few is the one that abandons you to another hand. You are relaxed to secular justice. The men in this room use the phrase as if it separates spiritual care from physical force, but the city knows the hands belong to the same body, and the body is the realm itself. At the sound of that formula, your stomach does the small thing anyone's stomach would do, and then it is done. Your fate has become the city's spectacle, not because you are remarkable, but because the city needs to see categories displayed in order, like a procession of tools hung on a wall. For reconciliations, the platform is smaller and the presence is more local. Parishioners gather under a sky that might be sullen or bright. The weather has no moral to carry, only a temperature for the memory. The priest preaches to the whole flock about error corrected and pride humbled, about the path back that remains, open so long as the heart can be persuaded to step upon it. You stand, wearing the coarse garment with painted crosses, the San Benito that itches in all seasons, and you feel how cloth can become a page others read. The faces in front of you contain an entire grammar of ordinary life, neighborly concern, weariness, discreet satisfaction, curious pity, and the blankness that is not cruelty but the human way of keeping distance from what cannot be fixed by a loaf of bread or a mended hinge. When the words are finished, you are given a schedule, like a craftsman receives a list of orders. Prayers on certain days, alms at certain times, presents at certain processions. The goal is to let the city see you and learn a lesson it believes will keep it whole. For sentences beyond reconciliation, a larger stage is prepared. You would recognize the labor of carpenters and tailors, of clerks and beadles, if you could see the preparations. A platform rises in a public space because spectacle needs both height and distance to make its lesson legible. Benches are arranged with a respect for hierarchy that the tribunal loves: officials, clergy, secular authorities, reconciled penitent souls, condemned onlookers. A great cross, the color of hope if one is disposed to see it, the color of command if one is disposed otherwise, stands as the emblem that unites the mourning. You may appear in person, or, if you have fled or died, in effigy, a figure that is meant to tie your name to a shape so that the city can be instructed even in your absence. In certain cases, bones are brought to stand in for the body, and the tribunal's narrative that nothing can slip through the mesh of memory. The reading of sentences begins, and it is long because length is part of the point. People must feel they have received a day's worth of limits and warning. The choreography follows the creed of categories. First come those reconciled after confession, garments scratching, faces searching for a place to rest their eyes in a crowd that will not quite meet them. Then come those who will be held for terms of years or life in places whose walls already know the prayers and curses of others who learned the discipline of stone. Then come those who will be moved along to the secular arm, who may hear their names in a tone that the officials keep flat to avoid the charge of frenzy. If, in your city, the ritual ends with flames, you will see how much of the work is done even before anything is lit. The lesson is a matter of order. The heat is only punctuation. And if the ritual ends with banishment or public labor or some other form of removal, the logic is the same. Visible categories, visible consequences, visible mercy, if the right words have been said at the right time. The San Benito follows you after the platform is disassembled and the city goes back to its trade. It can be permanent or for a season. It can be hung in a parish to remember your reconciliation with your name or your father's name, or, in some places, a mark that everyone knows how to read. The garment's shadow lingers on walls longer than on shoulders, turning churches into galleries of correction. Children learn to spell names by tracing them with their fingers on rough cloth. They learn to ask their elders whether they should play in front of this one or that one. The parish finds itself both advisor and archivist, tending souls in confession and tending cloth as a record. The garment is not cruel by itself. Its cruelty lies in the memory it insists upon, a memory that does not allow a person to finish serving a sentence because the sentence is continually performed in the gaze of others. After sentence, the daily arithmetic governs again with the small discipline of survival. If you are reconciled, you return to a shop that may have fewer customers than before, not because they hate you, but because they fear being questioned about their associations. You reprice your goods for patience rather than profit. You choose markets where faces are kinder. A neighbor lends you a tool quietly in the evening rather than in the morning, when eyes are sharpest. A guild may read your name aloud in a meeting and then assign you a duty that is meant to be visible and useful, a way to earn back, in the slow manner the city trusts. If you are confined, you learn the habits of a house that is neither home nor entirely misery. The measurements of a cell, the tendency of a lock to catch in damp weather, the sound of rain on a particular section of roof that leaks onto the third flagstone, but not the second. The years have a way of cooking a person down to the basics: breath, bread, a few prayers, a posture that does not offend the men who hold keys. If your case ended in confiscation, the auction changes your household in ways more permanent than the sentence itself. Chairs and chests acquire new owners who are forever after bound to your name. The table from the Castillo case, the house that once belonged to the silk weaver who wore the garment, the garden with the quince where the woman sang too softly. The new owners do not always relish these attachments. They sometimes feel the superstitious itch that memory can raise, but the city, hungry for order, eats what it is served, and the money raised pays wages and buys ink. And the file that describes your losses accepts the numbers without sentiment. In rooms where decisions are made, the sums are columns that prove sustainability. In rooms where children sleep, the sums are the reason a father fixes shoes for others instead of buying leather to make new ones. Time, which had been the tribunal's ally in extracting confession, becomes your ally in resuming a life that can pass under a neighbor's window without comment. You develop new rituals for legibility. You cross yourself more slowly where you know you are being watched. You hang a holy image at an angle that catches the light from the street. You take a seat at Mass where an usher cannot fail to notice you. You build small public acts into the calendar the way you once built deliveries and debts. It is not hypocrisy, it is a form of social architecture. You arrange your days to keep the house standing, to keep children apprenticed, to keep marriages possible, to keep your name from being the subject line of a new file. If you have sons and daughters, you teach them to give answers that are short and exact. If you have parents, you remind them gently not to tell long stories that wander into lanes where passers-by might mishear. There is a bureaucratic afterlife to your case that continues long after you have stopped counting the weeks. The tribunal sends summaries to parishes and guilds, to municipal councils, and sometimes to noble houses that are patrons of places where you might petition for employment. Lists grow in offices that operate within the law's shadow, lists of those who may not hold certain posts, lists of those whose marriages require special inquiry, lists of those who have been reconciled and therefore must be watched. Cleanliness of blood becomes a phrase that walks into admissions and exclusions, a phrase that can be waived in a manner perfectly legal and perfectly devastating. Books are kept, the names are alphabetized or indexed by father's name or street in a way that makes you findable even by those who do not remember your face. This, too, is part of how a sentence lives on in the ease with which a clerk can run a finger down a page and stop at your family. If your name was cleared, you live in that peculiar brightness that feels like shade, acquitted, but never entirely invisible again. You are grateful in the ways gratitude comes to people who live by their hands and their wits. Grateful for ordinary work, for a quiet supper, for a neighbor who does not cross the street. Yet there may be mornings when you feel the injustice of having been processed, recorded, and assessed, a man whose innocence had to be measured to be believed. The best response the city offers is bread bought without a whisper and a nod from a priest that contains both apology and reassurance in the tilt of a head. Institutions do not apologize. People do in gestures small enough to escape the file. The tribunal itself changes as it ages, and those changes meet lives like yours at their softest parts. In some seasons, rulers demand more spectacle, and the calendar fills with large ceremonies that draw merchants into the square and leave apprentices talking for days. In others, rulers demand efficiency, and sentences are carried out with less display and more paper. The machine adapts to budgets, to wars, to rulers' moods, to the ambitions of men who sit in chairs and write letters and keep their reputations polished. The result for you is a drift in the weather, a season of more or a season of less, but never a season of none. Even when nothing happens, the knowledge that something can happen presses on your ribs like a belt one notch too tight. There are cracks, as there always are. A priest speaks with more kindness than the law strictly requires and earns himself a quiet reprimand and the admiration of those who watched. A city official delays a notice until after a market day so that a family can sell its goods at a better price before a seizure. A jailer turns the key with a ritual that has become prayer, not for himself, but for those whose names he must repeat. These do not break the machine, they merely prove that people still exist inside it. And for those who see them, they provide a reason to keep a certain gentleness alive in households that must otherwise live under the steady draft of caution. If you shift your focus away from your own file and look at the shelves as a whole, you would see what officials see, a landscape of cases that, when taken together, tell the story of a city learning to be tidy. The officials are proud of the regularity, the city is proud of its safety, which it half believes is the fruit of vigilance, and half knows is simply the result of habit. The edges of this safety are visible where the city meets people who do not fit its current forms, newcomers, thinkers whose books wander, communities whose prayers do not align with the parish bell. At those edges, your case becomes a template that may be applied again with a few modifications. The language will change names, the verbs will remain the same. As for the children growing up in the wake of your sentence, they will inherit the posture you chose. If you taught them to be legible, they will be legible. If you taught them to be brave, they will learn which rooms are safe for bravery. They will tell stories about what happened in words you will recognize and in words you will not, because each decade teaches a new vocabulary for the same old human dilemmas. They will make the same bargains: safety for silence, honesty for loss, prudence for reputation, and they will tuck their regrets away where only spouses and very old friends can find them. This is not cynicism. It is the art of living together in a world where institutions ask to be fed and households must go on feeding themselves. You might imagine as you step back into the street on a day when your penance is done or your garment is retired to a nail on a chapel wall, that the past sits behind you like a finished room. But the city remembers in ways you do not control. You will sometimes be the man who wore the garment, the woman whose name is sewn on cloth, the family with the file. Just as often you will be the customer who pays on time, the neighbor who lends tools, the friend who keeps a confidence. The city, practical as ever, cares as much about bread as about banners. This, finally, is what allows life to continue, the quiet human desire to be useful and to be seen as useful, which smooths over rough histories without truly erasing them. And so you ask yourself, perhaps in the dark before sleep or in the noisy light of a market morning, whether the true sentence was the set of words read aloud or the new grammar you learned to speak afterward, a language of caution, procedure, and visible piety that shaped your days into lines the city could read. If that grammar were to loosen, if officials' pens were to grow tired, if rulers' appetites changed, if new ideas drifted through town with the spice crates, would you remember how to speak another way? Or after so many seasons of walking in the same careful rhythm, has the long afterlife of a file turned you and all your neighbors into authors of a story that can only be told in the measured sentences the tribunal taught you to say? You arrive in a valley that has learned to speak in water. The channels are narrow and old, cut with a steady hand into the slope, their edges lined with stones that know the tread of sandaled feet. The word for them is simple, acequias, and you can trace them from spring to terrace, from terrace to orchard, and then to the mouths that give back to the stream what cannot be used. If you walk beside one at dawn, you hear the slow clap of sluice doors, the skitter of pebbles when the flow changes course, and the quiet instructions exchanged between neighbors who share a schedule written not on paper, but on the muscle memory of wrists and ankles. This is the kingdom south after the banners have settled and the drums have been struck in victory. This is Granada as the 16th century begins, and you find yourself among people who were once named by one law and now live under another. People who water trees exactly as their ancestors did and yet cross themselves as the parish requests, because souls and orchards must both be tended if families are to remain whole. You see, even before you study a single document, that life is arranged by slopes and seasons. Mulberry leaves for silkworms, almond blossoms that risk the late frost, olives that wait for bruising hands, and vines that creep across stony ground too stubborn for anything else. The hills teach a lesson the city forgets, the slow and visible relationship between effort and survival. In the Alpujarras, where ridgelines fold like woven cloth and small hamlets cling to their flanks with whitewashed steadiness, the people, who will soon be called Moriscos, have reorganized themselves under the gaze of priests and notaries who keep ledgers in tidy hands. The word Morisco sits new and uneasy on tongues, meant to indicate Christians who came from Muslim households. New, Christians in a category that keeps them in view. The words that matter more here are older. Water turn, orchard, debt. The day when snow melts off the high places and floods the lower gardens, if the canal doors are not tended with attention that comes from childhood habits and a neighbor's trust. When you enter a village, you are taught a different map than the one the court would insist upon. The center is not the square, but the fountain. A boy approaches with a jar and averts his eyes politely because strangers notice, and his father has told him to keep facts in his mouth, not on his face. A woman cleans the lip of the basin before she fills her clay pitcher, and her movements carry a double memory: how her mother did this before the parish bell, and how the priest now explains the proper order of blessings at each hour. The treaty that once promised a gentler pace of change has already thinned. You hear its residue in the way older men whisper Arabic to soothe an infant, and then switch to Castilian when a neighbor crosses the threshold. It is not that the parish is cruel. It is that the parish is certain of what it must require. Sunday becomes a public proof. Attendance, confession at regular intervals, children named for saints in a rhythm that suits the calendar. Behind these, the old timekeepers persist. Nights counted by moons, tasks by the phases when water is plentiful or grudging. Silk is the valley's delicate arithmetic. You step into a courtyard where trays of mulberry leaves carry the faint, sweet smell that silkworms make into something miraculous and marketable. The work is women's work when the worms are feeding, and men's work when the cocoons are sold for cash, in towns where scales are tested with small weights that a merchant keeps in a pouch like a rosary. The cycle is as old as anyone remembers, and that is itself a problem for those who insist that identity must be visible not only in church, but in the way one makes a living. Certain crafts, dyeing, metalwork, the tending of gardens in complicated terrain, are marked with an accent from before the conquest, and the mark follows families into confessionals where a priest who has learned a little of the local habits asks simple questions designed to anchor hearts. Can you say the prayers? Do you teach your children to say them? Do you eat what your neighbors eat? Do you stand when they stand and kneel when they kneel? These questions make sense to a man whose work is to gather a flock under a single language. They sit less easily in the mind of a farmer whose day is already stitched tight by dawn and dusk, who must plan for irrigation and grazing, and the tiny profit he can squeeze from narrow terraces that never grow wider, no matter how patient his shovel. You pay attention to food because the city and its officers pay attention to food. Pork appears often in village markets, sometimes in quantities that feel more symbolic than nutritional. You cannot tell whether a house serves it out of appetite or prudence. The smell of frying lard is one more signal among many that says, to anyone who might wonder, we are inside the fence. In some kitchens, grandmothers remind children to wash in a way that is a memory rather than a law, and the mother interrupts gently with a new sequence that the parish favors, and the child learns two routines without quite understanding why one must happen behind a closed door and the other in a doorway where a neighbor's glance can serve as witness. There is nothing wicked in these accommodations. They are the practical art of surviving in a world that requires different performances in different rooms and sees consistency as a moral proof rather than a convenience. Names change subtly too. The boy once called by a name shaped by a different alphabet is now Juan. The girl whose grandmother's name was a long, soft string of vowels becomes Maria. Baptismal records accumulate in the parish chest, a wooden box with a lock, whose key the priest keeps under his pillow, and the names are the grammar of belonging. The parish priest, often a man who knows his flock by smell as well as by sight, writes with a slow hand, careful to spell the surnames in the way the chancery prefers. He instructs his clerks to note godparents with reputations that give cover, a farmer from a family with no rumours sticking to it, the wife of the carpenter who repaired the church door, who is known for her predictability. If a child falls ill, the priest and midwife arrive together, one with oils and Latin, the other with herbs and the impatient competence of someone who has brought more children into the world than any man will ever meet. In such rooms, categories fade, and the only identity that matters is the one that divides the living from the dying. Beyond the parish, the Crown sends men with instructions to transform difference into legible forms. They ask for language, Castilian, in schools and in contracts. They ask for clothes, no more garments that a distant court recognizes as the difference of another empire. They ask for doors to be open at certain hours so that the public nature of household piety can be seen without intruding more than necessary. You see listening in the room that follows any announcement. Heads dip, eyes search the floor. And then life continues with the slight adjustments by which a population learns to live under two clocks. A father who once counted the day by the position of the sun over a ridge now adds the sound of the parish bell to his calculations. A son who once learned a prayer in a language no longer welcome in public now learns to say it in a new tongue, while the old syllables become lullabies for his own children. Suspicion lives in the city more than in the hills, but it travels like a salesman and finds work wherever people gather. A neighbor reports a pattern of Fridays that look too neat. An officer files the note and waits for another report to complete an entry in a ledger. You notice that ledgers breed categories, and categories breed observation. A community that once organized itself around water turns and harvests begins to organize itself, at least in the eyes of the law, around gestures and words. It is a change that causes a kind of spiritual fatigue. People who spend their days measuring terraces now measure sentences, and to survive, they learn to repeat the safe ones. You notice the skill with which a woman can talk about bread and candles at the same time, wrapping one in the other, until it becomes impossible to separate piety from household economy. The geography of survival is not only physical, though the physical is its foundation. Valleys allow for a certain privacy of custom because sounds do not travel far, and the people who already must coordinate irrigation know how to coordinate other things without documents, but the geography is also legal and social. A landlord who depends on tenants to keep orchards alive takes on the role of a shield against overzealous interference. His letters to officials in town are polite, but firm, reminding them that productivity is a form of loyalty. A magistrate who grew up with boys, now called by different names, softens the edge of an edict in its application because he can narrate a family's history better than any file can. These gentlenesses do not nullify policy, they lubricate it, so that the machine can grind less harshly on ordinary days. You realize that the space between law and life is filled with the decisions of small men, and that gratitude for such decisions is stored in memory like seed grain, to be used when a bad season arrives. You begin to see that the art of survival here is a daily calculus of visibility. A household arranges its courtyard so that certain things are done where they can be seen, children reciting, a crucifix hung in good light, a saint's day meal offered to a priest whose presence will be remembered. Other things, quiet washing, the preservation of a proverb shaped in a different grammar, a hand gesture before taking a sip of water, are moved into the cool interior where memory can survive without being recruited into a case file. The division is not perfect, and sometimes the wrong thing is seen by the wrong person. Sometimes the right thing is forgotten at the wrong moment. People forgive each other more than the city will admit because everyone knows how narrow the terraces are and how easily a foot can slip. On market days, you step into towns where rules are tested by distance and noise. Traders who came up from the coast with salt fish and stories of other ports drink wine with traders who came down from the hills with sacks of almonds whose weight has been argued since dawn. Here, language bends more easily. Coin smooths accents. The measure of a man is whether he pays, not where his grandfather prayed. News travels in both tongues, as it always has, because profit requires understanding, and stories about storms and taxes are understood by anyone who has ever tried to make a living with hands and patience. You see that while the court imagines unity as a single sound, the market imagines it as the harmony of different sounds that do not resolve but do not clash. Yet beneath the ordinary there is an accumulation of pressure that belongs not to any single day but to a season that the elder men feel in their bones. The rules tighten slowly, edicts about language in public, laws about clothing, visits by officials who insist on checking that the children's names match the saint's calendar. Each rule by itself is manageable. Together they teach the body to carry itself differently in doorways and fields. A daughter is told to sing softly when she hums a melody the grandmother used to sing. A son is told to respond quickly when a priest greets him in the lane. You understand that families become small schools where the subject is prudence, taught with humor when possible and with sternness when necessary. The same father who teaches his boy how to measure water flow by the way a twig floats also teaches him which phrases to say automatically when asked about fasts. Both lessons are survival, both are passed from hand to hand. You might be tempted to judge this care as a kind of cowardice until you watch a man clear a canal in spring, cutting away winter's clutter with a tool so sharp and practiced that it looks like a dance. He is not timid, he is scientific in a world that will not call it science. He observes, adjusts, and repeats. He knows that one slip of the wrist can starve a field, and that memory is not sentiment but instruction that keeps a family from hunger. The same mind that learns the speed of water learns the speed of suspicion and calibrates the household accordingly. This is not a story about heroic defiance or abject surrender. It is a story about the ordinary genius of staying alive and decent when institutions insist on visible conformity as the price of peace. As the years roll toward a new king and a new set of appetites at court, you begin to hear distant talk of more serious interventions. Men whose hands are soft from papers rather than ploughs argue that the only way to settle the matter is to remove the old language not only from the market but from the mouth, to insist on marriages that sew families into the fabric so tightly that the old threads cannot be pulled without tearing the cloth. The people in the valley do not hear these arguments as something abstract. They feel them as the edge of a blade that may one day slice through the cords that tie a household to a piece of land. And so, in the cool evenings when the work is done, after prayers said in the right sequence with the right words, after a meal that features the right foods at the right time, old men and women tell stories to children that go carefully nowhere, stories about clever foxes and patient shepherds, and then let the night carry away the last words so that nothing remains that could be sorted into a category and pinned to a page. In this quiet, with frogs beginning their spring chorus and a dog turning twice before sleep, you find a question settling into your chest like a small stone. How long can a garden watered by memory continue to bear fruit in a climate that insists memory must be amended? The terraces hold together for now, the channels carry their loads, the parish registers swell with names that prove belonging, and the households have learned the choreography that keeps peace. But you feel the weight of a season turning on, a hinge you cannot see. When a kingdom that values order meets a countryside that values continuity, which gives way first, the state's appetite for uniformity, or the valley's knowledge that water and patience are the only reliable gods a farmer has ever been able to serve, you return to the valley as the century runs deeper and find that the words have grown heavier. The parish registers, which once felt like a hedge planted around belonging, have become a wall that demands climbing. Names are policed for their correctness. The priest's hand hesitates when a grandmother insists on a variant that carries the soft vowels of her own mother's mother, and the priest, kind enough, writes it as the court would prefer, adding the saint's day beside it, like a seal of acceptance. The children learn their catechism with a competence that would please a bishop, sign of the cross, act of contrition, the creed spoken in the rhythm of the village. But when they run to the fountain, they sing the melodies that live in there. legs rather than the ones they mouth on Sundays. Life is double without being duplicitous. You see the art of living as a braid rather than a knot. Language becomes a battle waged not in argument but in habits. A decree reaches the valley that asks for Arabic to be set aside even as a kitchen tongue. The men from town insist that all books in such letters be surrendered for safekeeping or destruction. The books that exist are few and fragile, more poetry than law, more recipes for household life than arguments about God, and the women who keep them know that the paper smells like memories of mothers teaching daughters to boil lentils and wash floors. A compromise is found in some houses. The words are copied in the Roman letters the court prefers, and the old texts become new in form, even if everyone who reads them hears the older cadence marching beneath the newer shapes. The inspector from town is shown shelves so tidy that even he is soothed, and the real pages live in chests where linens lay against them like a disguise. The pressure builds in a handful of visible places: clothing, weddings, the timing of weekly routines. A jacket cut in a style that travelled down a ridge with an uncle who has been dead for 20 years is folded away in a chest and taken out only at night, for touching, not wearing. Weddings are staged with excess Catholic decorum to make them proof as well as celebration, candles multiplied, saints' images borrowed for the day and returned with gifts in gratitude. Fridays are marked by work very deliberately done in public. A man fixes his roof tiles with loud care. A woman kneads dough on a table set by an open door. A boy is sent to fetch pork from the butcher with a coin pressed into his palm, and the instruction to be conspicuous about it. These are not mockeries of devotion, they are advertisements of legibility. You see how the cost of belonging is paid in attention, and how attention paid too often begins to feel like a tax that grows. With each collection, townsmen bring edicts about baths and gatherings. Communal baths, even those fed by old springs that once had a reputation for healing a twisted ankle or a stubborn cough, draw notice as places where old customs might ride on steam and laughter. The baths are ordered closed or reconfigured, and a generation later children know them only as stories about a different time when winter's chill did not keep people out of the water. Gatherings that were once indistinguishable from market bustle acquire a scent of suspicion if the wrong men are seen talking too long, and so men learn to talk to a variety of men and to end every conversation by mentioning the priest's name, in some benign way, as if all roads finally led back to the parish in both imagination and law. Taxes arrive as always, but the categories in which they are assessed begin to mutate. Silk is taxed as a sign of prosperity tied to a past the court would like to manage more closely. Certain crafts are taxed not only for their profit but for the social territories they represent. A landlord whose tenants are known to come from households under watch buffers the blow with his own accounts, because to drive tenants from terraces is to destroy the capital for the sake of clean books. He writes letters to men who read letters all day, and he uses a vocabulary that he knows will soothe productivity, stability, loyalty, the avoidance of disorder, the maintenance of the king's peace in districts where the soil is thin and the wind is harsh. Meanwhile, in the city, men who dream of order the way another man dreams of a perfect harvest begin to see the valley as a test case for uniformity that will radiate out to other corners. They draft a pragmatica that asks for the remainder of the old to be turned into the new in a single generation, in a single decade if necessary, and they write as if language can be evicted from a mouth as easily as a goat from a courtyard. You watch the edict shatter upon the rocks of habit and find that the stones are harder than paper, but you also see where paper cuts, shallow, repeated, and in places where no one thought to put callous. The cascade of orders is not evil in intention, it is impatient. It wants the slow work of conversion and cohesion to happen at the pace of a bell, not a season. Inside houses, families run their own councils. A father announces that the household will conform more strictly, not because he believes, but because he calculates. He makes a list, and lists are better at convincing him than sermons, of what is at stake: a lease up for renewal, a daughter's betrothal, a son's apprenticeship, with a blacksmith whose shop stays open because no one asks the wrong questions. A mother organizes her trousseau gifts for that daughter with the same meticulous care as the men with pens, choosing items that broadcast competence rather than difference. Linen embroidered with flowers that are no one's heraldry, wooden spoons carved with the same simple vine pattern seen on the shelves of the most unimpeachable households. A grandmother tells a story that has been edited so carefully that even its ending has become ambiguous, so that no sentence can be accused of pointing any direction other than toward bed. And yet there is only so far a people can bend before the spine insists on straightening. The mountains are not simply places for terraces and goats. They are places for gatherings where the new language drops and the old returns with the ease of a hand finding a familiar tool without looking. Young men, bored and stung, take pride in accents their fathers have taught them to keep under cover. Old men, no longer frightened of anything particular, because the worst to them is losing the orchards to neglect, speak freely for an hour beside a stream, and then revert to caution at the sound of a twig snap. Ideas curdle into plans, and plans, in a land that teaches patience, nevertheless find the suddenness of a storm. Skirmishes multiply from kitchen words to stones thrown to blades unsheathed. The first victims are always the vulnerable and the unlucky. A priest who came to bless a field and found an ambush. A shepherd whose path crossed the wrong path at the wrong hour. A woman who tended a wounded boy and was marked for harboring disobedience. The crown responds in the only language it trusts in such moments. Troop movements, new governors, edicts extended and edged with punishment, promises of clemency for those who step forward early. These are not bad men, most of them. They are administrators who believe in the beauty of a map without blotches. They write to the court about the need for firmness, and the court, which lives at a distance from water and terrace and the exact weight of a basket of olives, nods and seals replies. The men with files start new files. The men with swords polish them. The valley notices the glint on a ridge and knows that a season is ending. If you stand in a doorway in one of the high villages and watch a line of soldiers wind up a path that goats walk with more grace, you will feel, the way one feels a change in the pressure of the air before a storm, that the household bargains of the last decades will be called due all at once. Men have learned where to hide and where to run. They have learned the possibilities of the scrub and the gullies. They have learned which thickets can swallow a man and which will betray him with a branch that snaps too loud. Women have learned to move children in silence and to pack in a single cloth what a family cannot live without for 2 days. Priests have learned to carry the oil and a small book in a pouch that can be tucked under a cloak, and to say Latin softly under their breath so that it is real even if it cannot be heard. The valley, in other words, has learned to be a place of knowledge about survival. What it has not learned is whether that knowledge can put off the inevitable when a kingdom decides to make of the people who live here a lesson for the whole realm. So you ask a question that seems too big for a village and yet belongs to it.
More than to any desk in the capital, when an empire of paper and schedules meets a mountain of habit and patience, which will be reshaped.
Will the valley teach the state to slow down and make room for layered lives? Or will the state convince itself that the only neatness worth having is the kind that leaves orchards untended and names unspoken because their speakers have been sent away, folded into the lines of a plan that believes geography is an ornament rather than a teacher? The sound you hear first is not the trumpet of a charge, but the crack and hiss of brush set alight. Rebellion, when it comes to these hills, is not a cavalry opera. It is a series of suddennesses that add up to a season, a bell rung at a strange
hour, a shout that tells you to run. Not because you will be killed, but because you will be caught. A flock driven mad by men who do not move like shepherds. The young men go first, proud in a way that frightens their mothers more than any blade ever could.
The older men go later, knowing this will not end well, but also knowing that the counting of days has turned against them, and that if they do not stand in a ravine today, they will be standing under questioning tomorrow, which is a more exhausting posture. You see, in the first months, the art of mountain fighting taught quickly by a geography that does not yield to maps. The paths are old, and the ambushes learn them in a week. There is no grand plan, only dozens of little plans that use the same grammar. Let them climb, make them climb too far, let them grow thirsty, show them an easy way out that is not easy at all. The defenders know where the snow lingers late and the sun sits early. They wear the land like clothing, hard and fitted. They strike, vanish, burn a storehouse because hunger weakens armies without drawing blood, and then pelt down a slope that a horse will never like. From a ridge you see columns of smoke like punctuation marks breaking the sky's sentence without any change in its meaning. The crown learns quickly, too. Men of talent are sent who understand that patience belongs to them as much as to the rebels. They study the pattern and set their own small forts in places where a mountain's whim usually decides who can pass. Control of water, where it hurts the most, offers to men who can be bought with a lease more secure than their fathers ever had. In the high villages, men whisper that the one edge the army has is a promise that, in the moment, can taste sweeter than the memory of insult. Amnesty for those who walk down before a certain date. Safety for families who renounce the right to wash in the order of their grandfathers and instead agree to sing a hymn more loudly on Sundays so that no one can miss the correct syllables. It is a tactic as old as kingdoms, and it works as often as it fails. You watch men count futures on their fingers. If we run where? If we fight, we lose when? If we surrender, we live how? The violence gathers its own momentum, and villages become stages for the kinds of scenes that fill ballads men sing badly in taverns a generation later. There is the small fort taken by a night climb and a ladder of branches tied with old cloth. The officer who eats the same cold bread as his men for 6 weeks and earns their obedience beyond fear. The priest who stands in a doorway with arms wide, the Latin worn down to a single plea that the men hear as a mother's scolding. The woman who spills a basket of stones in a lane and keeps soldiers back 10 minutes longer than their officers guessed possible. These details matter because they are the only ones people will remember when the tide has run out, when all that is left are stories told in kitchens by those who stayed. Campaigns end, as they must, with the weight of the state applied in places the mountain cannot refuse to take seriously. New commanders arrive with names that courtiers love to celebrate. They bring more than swords. They bring routines. The routines are dull on paper and devastating on the ground. Census, movement, division, transport. Men who once spent their days writing about taxes now write about roads. The high valleys are emptied the way a chest is emptied when you need to find the letter you lost at the bottom. Families are gathered and told to prepare for moving, not to the coast and away, not yet, but out of the ridges into the flat places where a map looks like a chessboard. The idea is simple and has the elegance that only someone far from the work can praise. If the problem is geography that hides habits, remove the people from the geography. Put them in a place where lines are easy to draw and the air carries the priest's words in straight shots across fields. The removal is the beginning of an ending. The men who once watered terraces now stare at land that does not hold water the same way, and their hands feel stupid for a season. The women who once dried goat's milk on a flat rock under a wind they knew like an aunt now take their baskets to wells that smell of another family's laundry. Neighbours are no longer neighbours. Strangers are told to be neighbours under the logic that the parish grid can make kin out of proximity. It works with a certain precision because people are better at surviving than plans are at predicting. In a year, you hear the new rhythms: a woman trading eggs for linen, a man patching a roof he did not build and therefore cannot love, a child counting in a different order because the schoolmaster counts that way. The fire in the hills goes out not because there was not enough dry brush, but because the men who tended it have been set to tend other work. And whatever else they are serious about work. But this is not the end of the story. The end is coastal and slow, made of ships and lists. Some decades later, the valley's descendants live in other regions, Valencia's gardens, Aragon's plains, and the kingdom insists on a final neatness that the valley could not accommodate, an expulsion that uses the vocabulary of mercy, time to sell, time to settle affairs, even as it acts with the surgeon's cold efficiency. You walk the quays in ports that have learned the rhythm of departure for other reasons: wool, wine, silver, and now must move people. Officials count heads and argue with shipmasters about capacity and the price that can be justified. Families line up under a sun that does not seem to care about the difference between a line for almonds and a line for exile. The objects they carry are too small to be called a life: pots, knives, a spindle, a small wrapped packet of soil that the grandmother swears will make the new garden grow like the old. The men who sell tickets call this kindness. The men who inspect for contraband call it a breach. The women who carry the packets call it insurance, in a world that has nullified all their policies. Some do not go, of course. They change again. They slip into the crevices opened by a kingdom that, however much it loves neatness, cannot be everywhere. A boy who had another name becomes a boy with a name from the parish list and grows into a man who tells his children not who they are, but what they must do. Plant here, harvest then, save this, avoid that, go to church, and listen with your back straight, because bending makes noise. A woman who once kept a book in a trunk burns it with her own hands because she will not have her granddaughter learn that paper can testify against a family, and she keeps the memory of its words in her mouth where no officer can find them. The parish, which is composed of human beings, learns to regard such families with a kindness that cannot be written into a rule, and therefore survives the end of the rules that attempted to make kindness dangerous. In the places where those who went arrive, new habits are learned with a speed that comes from necessity. Coasts on the other side of the water receive people who have carried seeds of craft, irrigation knowledge, soap making, a way with silkworms that is more intimate than any manual could teach. They rebuild, and in rebuilding, stitch their narrative, together with the old threads and the new. In letters that travel precariously across water and border, they send back news that comforts no one and everyone. There is bread. There are neighbors. There is a priest who looks the other way if you keep your head down. There is a governor who looks very closely if anyone looks up. The letters do not have a moral, because this story is not one that rewards virtue with ease. It rewards patience with the possibility of another season, which is the only currency farmers have ever trusted. Back in the emptied villages, the terraces collapse under rain that no longer has hands to direct it. The stones slide in small
avalanches that sound like the sigh of a very old woman deciding to sit down at last.
The channels silt, fill with weeds, and become ruins that look, to a passing traveller, like the work of giants rather than the work of men whose sons now sell soap in a port where the language shapes the mouth differently. And yet even here, the world refuses total loss. New families come, some from just over the ridge, some from a day's walk, and they take the stones and set them differently, learn the valley's grammar by trial and error, and plant vines where mulberries once stood because vines are what they know. The hills do not remember names, they remember patience. That is why they seem to forgive groping hands. In the city, the files close with the cleanliness that officials enjoy. Names are crossed out of lists, other names are added to fill their places in guilds and offices. Accounts are balanced, and the line that records profit from confiscations is neat and short, unlike the line that records loss in villages that the file does not know how to include. A generation learns to talk about the expulsion as a fact, not as a choice. The word itself becomes the kind of word that children memorize for examinations. In parlors where men talk about empire, the story is told with an emphasis on unity and strength. In kitchens where women scrape bread bowls clean, the story is told with an emphasis on how many blankets a child needs in the first winter in a house that isn't home. You walk one last time along a dry channel and feel the strangeness of a landscape that has been taught to forget and cannot quite manage it. A fragment of a prayer that is not in the parish book floats up from a corner you thought empty. A child uses a word for a tool that no longer exists but which his grandfather taught him anyway, because names too are seeds and some sprout in places no one expects. You realize that the effort to sculpt a single identity out of a country that grew on layers produces a shape that looks smooth from a distance and feels full of ridges up close. The people who lived between cross and crescent learned to live also between file and field, between the certainty of a church that loved order and the certainty of a hillside that loved patience. It is not clear which certainty will matter in the longer run, and perhaps that is the lesson the hills were trying to teach all along, that survival has never belonged entirely to a rule or to a prayer, but to the hand that knows how to hold water long enough to make a seed believe in. Tomorrow, you open a book and discover that before you can read a single line, you must pass through a small forest of permissions. The cover tells you who printed it and where, the title page tells you who wrote it, and sometimes what he hopes it will accomplish, and in the first leaves you see the marks that the city insists upon, licenses to print, approvals by men whose job is to cross out or to permit, dates that tell the story of a text's journey from a mind to a press to a stall to a hand. The book is not, in this world, a mere object of curiosity or instruction. It is a controlled substance. If you follow it backward, you find a printer whose shop smells of ink and metal, type set by men with blackened hands who must compose not
only lines but the argument for why the lines deserve to exist in public.
You find a censor who sits under a window where the light is good, who has learned to move efficiently through pages because the appetite for permission exceeds his day, who knows the difference between silence that protects and silence that wounds. The city has a routine for the life of a book. A printer petitions to publish. The petition goes to an office where a clerk checks a list of indices and remembers, if he is tired, to loosen his jaw as he reads so that he will not grind his teeth at a phrase that rang loudly in another case years ago. The book goes to a reader the city has deputized, a man who knows theology enough to become uncomfortable at the first hint of straying, and who, precisely because he is not a fool, knows also to mark the places that can be permitted if a word is changed here, a sentence there. The result is an expurgation that leaves the book both itself and not itself. Lines are trimmed, references to the wrong authorities are flagged and made more distant, and small words are substituted that make a thought less sharp and therefore, in the eyes of the office, less dangerous. At the port, where ships cough out, crates that have been jostled across storm and calm, these routines become a public drama of private items. Inspectors open boxes and pull out volumes wrapped in straw, bound in leather that ranges from proud to practical. They match titles against lists of forbidden texts and against letters from men who have made their careers on the edge where knowledge meets policy. Sometimes a book is seized, sometimes it is allowed with a note that it must be kept in a library, under lock to be read only by those who possess the stomach for such knowledge and the presumed immunity to its temptations. The port bleeds into the shop bleeds into the study bleeds into a kitchen where someone reads aloud from a banned volume, not because its ideas are radical, but because its sentences taste like something other than the bread and vegetables they have eaten for years. Censorship here is not only about heresy, it is about control of the speed at which a world can change. The same office that worries about doctrines worries also about astrology that persuades the gullible, about romances that tilt young minds too far into fantasy to be of use to their fathers' trades, about medical texts that show bodies with a frankness that in the wrong hands becomes prurience rather than science. The rule is always the same. Knowledge is dangerous when it moves fast among those untrained to digest it. The response is also always the same. Slow it down, put it behind a door that requires a key held by a man who likes to say the word responsibility, replace a line with an ellipsis that the attentive eye recognizes as a scar. Printers are cautious and clever. They keep two sets of type for certain lines, one that will satisfy the office, one they will place on the page for certain trusted buyers who want the text whole. This is not defiance so much as commerce's typical willingness to accommodate appetites that laws do not know how to name. A printer, whose shop sits near a convent, prints devotions with a speed that astonishes and sends them mules distances into the countryside, because nothing is more innocent than a prayer if it is licensed, and nothing sells more steadily than a small book to be read between chores. That same printer keeps a back room where a man can come at odd hours to buy a volume of philosophy whose pages smell faintly of lamp smoke from another country. The printer does not write that sale in his main ledger. He writes it in a notebook. He keeps under a loose floorboard with the type he will need when the next fashionable book is whispered into the city by a sailor with a steady eye. Readers respond with their own routines. A woman buys a book for her husband and hides it in a sack of flour, not because she is ashamed, but because she understands that shelves can be inventoried and sacks are less interesting to men in hats. A university student copies by hand a chapter that he cannot afford to own, and the copying teaches him more than the reading would have, but he still longs for the heft of a volume that gives the illusion of ownership that the notes never do. A priest collects commentaries, all licensed, and keeps one unlicensed text behind the statue of a saint who, he is certain, approves of truth even when truth arrives with a stamp that says it should be read in Latin only. The saint and the priest share a look that the city cannot outlaw, a small complicity in favor of words that do not injure anyone but could, in theory, loosen bolts the city prefers tightened. In the book trade, you learn about classification as a way of life. The forbidden is a category that breeds subcategories, forbidden because it denies a doctrine, forbidden because it misrepresents a fact, forbidden because it inflames an appetite that makes a household less stable. Each book, if alive at all, also resists these categories. A volume of medicine, carefully cut, is saved from the fire because the hands that would have thrown it in know too many children whose fevers require something more than a folk remedy. A romance is tolerated in a household where the mother recognizes in its heroine a courage that she wants her daughters to learn in a world that gives them few models of movement. The censors, when they are not at their desks, are men too. They have wives who ask for stories and children who ask for pictures. The habits of the office relax a little at home, which is why the men who occupy the office work to make all homes seem a bit like extensions of the office. Uniformity is the dream that can never wake to its own irony. From time to time, the city stages a spectacle of correction. A pile of seized books is made into a scene, and the fire that eats them is described as purification rather than destruction. Men with torches repeat the phrases they have read in manuals about the danger of pages that announce their authority without the church's seal, and the onlookers are meant to feel a mixture of relief and warning. It is never quite clear that anyone believes a book is less dangerous as ash than it was as ideas in a head, but the ritual is not designed to defeat ideas. It is designed to remind the city who hands out permission to say them out loud. If you listen closely at the edge of the crowd, you hear a boy whisper a sentence he read in a book like the ones burning, and promise himself he will remember every word so that the fire will not win. He will forget half and tell the rest to a friend in a garbled form that will start another kind of book, the kind that lives only as talk. The countryside holds its own libraries, the aljamiado texts that turn one language's words into another. Language is letters, testimonies to a stubbornness of memory that neither parish nor office can quite shut down. A grandmother reads her granddaughter a prayer, written in characters that would bring a frown to a censor's face, and the prayer works just as well as the one in the parish primaire because the girl's fear, which is what prayers must address, does not recognize letters so much as tone. In a corner of a chest sits a manual of irrigation copied by hand from a copy that arrived with an uncle who never learned to write but could hold a picture of channels and gates in his head without effort. These are not books in the capital's sense. They are instructions, recipes, and consolations that make life precise and survivable. You understand that the state's ambition is to make a single library, approved, catalogued, inspected, and that the people's ambition is to keep many libraries private, haphazard, pragmatic, sewn into clothing or stored in the mouth. The conflict is not always violent, but it is constant. Sometimes the state wins a season, and talk becomes careful, and a generation learns to nod at the right phrases and quote the right authors. Then a teacher with a light in his eyes arrives in a small schoolroom and tells the children a story about stars that are not angels, but suns, and a child hears a different kind of awe that neither denies God nor satisfies the office. The office responds by strengthening the license for astronomy if it speaks of movement, and the license for theology if it speaks of meaning, and the child grows up to be a man who knows the difference and will occasionally blur it to the benefit of his students because he prefers the truth to categories when the categories are too small. You notice the slow march of ideas that no office can grab by the coat and stop. Medical diagrams grow more accurate. A surgeon does not ask permission to wash his hands before a birth because he does not need permission to reduce the number of deaths on his watch. A geographer draws a map that puts a coast in a place the court would prefer it not to be, and the ships, being ships, care more for the map than for the court. A mathematician finds that a trick of numbers discovered in a book from somewhere the office mistrusts helps a tax collector do his sums without error, and the office, being fond
Of sums does not burn the numbers.
the boundaries, serve the men who enforce them until they do not, and then the boundaries are reimagined with solemnity as if nothing had changed except precision. What you keep coming back to as you watch a censor turn a page with a certain kind of gentleness that better men reserve for children and bread is that censorship's daily life is profoundly boring, and that this boredom is its power. A dramatic burning wins a moment, 1,000 small crossings out get a generation. The people who believe in such crossings believe they are saving households from disarray, that they are keeping minds from flying apart like poorly made barrels. And sometimes they are right. A book that convinces a man to bet his tools on a fury he feels for an author's rhetoric may ruin a family. But boredom is not neutral. It grinds. If it is applied without respect for the small, practical ways households feed themselves, it becomes a millstone that the strong can carry with sighs and the weak cannot carry at all. You set the book down and look out the window at a sky indifferent to lists, and you wonder whether the attempt to manage reading can ever be anything other than a demonstration of the state's desire for a world without surprises. The trouble is that the world keeps producing them. Storms at sea, absent rains, children who ask questions no one has listed yet, instruments that show new spots on old objects. If the office wants to stay itself, it must widen or harden. If it widens, it ceases to be the office as it was. If it hardens, it ceases to be as useful as it thinks. So you find yourself asking whether the book, quietly, in a kitchen, in a hand that smells of garlic and soap, wins in the long run because it has the patience to wait between covers until a reader comes who will not ask its permission to live.